All right, welcome to our 10 o'clock session. I am Derek Kavanaugh with the Wisconsin Lakes Board of Directors. And this session is going to be have a rapid fire session. We've got a lot of great presenters in a short period of time. So our first presentation is solving water management concerns by repairing watersheds, information and tools we need. And this is going to be presented by Aaron O'Brien of the Wetlands Association and Anders Shropshire and Samuel Pratt.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm really happy to be here as part of Water Week to talk about one of my favorite topics, solving problems. And the project I'm going to be talking about is an evaluation that UW Extension and Wisconsin Wetlands Association collaborated on to look at the status of hydrologic assessment and restoration in Wisconsin. And I'll explain those terms as we go forward here. But I want to start with a little bit of, why isn't my slides exam? There we go. A little bit of 101 on basic hydrologic processes. So this is a very educated group, and I know most of you know that understand watersheds and that they're healthy when all waters are above and below ground, waters are clean, well connected, and resilient. When we think about the components of our hydrologic systems and the jobs that different waterways do, rivers, the work they do is predominantly to convey water, sediments, and nutrients. In contrast, wetlands perform functions on the landscape that store, process, and release materials. And of course, when any part of the system, the hydrology is degraded, it can create imbalances across the system. And because all water flows down hills, our downstream communities, cities, villages, towns, and our downstream waters, so our lakes and our larger rivers, tend to bear the brunt of some of those changes. I want to take you on a quick photo essay of what some of these degraded features look like on our landscape. We have obviously a lot of what I'd call planned wetland drainage, so tiling and ditching to make way for farms and developments. But there's also a lot of unplanned wetland drainage. So these are situations on the landscape where erosion has created features like gullies and head cuts that cut paths through the land and behave like drainage ditches. And this is really common across the state, though not necessarily well understood, and not a lot of work being done to repair these kinds of features. We've straightened and moved a lot of our rivers aside. Of course, we see this in a lot of areas of the state. And many of our streams and rivers no longer are able to interact with their floodplains. So either through some of the erosive processes that incise channels and lower the bed of the river, or deposition of eroding material on top of the floodplain, sometimes both, as shown here, creating situations where that stream no longer has room to move and process water and slow water down as it's meant to. And of course, lots of other ways that we've altered flow paths through dams and building of roads, rail beds, placement of culverts, and more. And these kinds of changes have consequences, and the cumulative effects of them, of course, are that our rivers are running dirty, and our communities are flooding. And of course, these circumstances are also not beneficial to fish and wildlife and other ways that we use and enjoy our waters. The good news is that there's a lot of opportunity to repair degraded hydrology around the state if we put our minds to it. So I want to define these terms, and I think I've got someone on standby to put these in the chat because I'm going to go quickly, but we're talking about, with hydrologic restoration, practices designed to return wetland, stream, and floodplain hydrology to a natural and self-regulating condition in order to achieve a lot of different kinds of goals. So all of the things we're all working on: slowing the flow of runoff, reducing flooding, reducing erosion, improving storage, habitat, etc. Doing this kind of work, though, does take advanced planning and assessment. And because water is part of a hydrologic system, we're really talking about work that needs to happen, assessment that needs to happen at a watershed scale, to look at where and how water used to move across the landscape, what's changed, what can be restored or improved to help address specific watershed challenges. This is technical work, so it needs to be interdisciplinary in nature. So now we'll talk about this evaluation. Our goals were to assess the extent of current hydrologic assessment and restoration efforts in the state, to identify opportunities to integrate this type of work into current state-sponsored programs, and to identify barriers to that integration, and overall to look at where are there opportunities to improve our programs to support this kind of work. And this latter piece was really important because the project was funded by the Environmental Protection Agency through a wetland program development grant, which is money that is given to state institutions to help them develop policies and programs to protect, restore, and manage wetlands and connected waters. So this was a three-step project, starting with agency coordination, because we did not want this to be just an academic exercise. The point of this was to have a dialogue with the agencies that are doing land and water management work to help inform their program decisions. So the collaboration was very strong with DNR and DATCP to develop the methods and the goals of the evaluation, and then all of the partners shown on your screen to help us identify the participants, so who would be the right representatives from the various programs across state and local agencies to join this conversation. Then there was a pre-survey in November, and then we held 3 virtual focus groups in December and January. Now, when looking at the design for this evaluation, we asked ourselves, what groups or what types of people need to be part of the conversation to develop hydrologic assessment and restoration program supports in the state. And we identified 3 categories of professionals: the technical experts, so this would be your hydrologists, your engineers, your academic researchers, state agency personnel, so those that are involved in the development and implementation of policies and programs, and then local implementers. Here we're talking about predominantly county land conservation staff and those who support them. So DATCP, regional engineers, county extension agents, et cetera. All total, we had 33 participants, and representing a very wide range of agencies, as well as different programs within those agencies, as shown on the right. Oops. So like I said, we sent a pre-survey to all participants prior to the focus groups. And this was because we wanted this conversation to be both iterative and additive, where the perspectives of all 3 segments of those professional categories were represented and informing the discussion. So we did the pre-survey, we summarized the results, and then when we got to the focus groups themselves, we were able to present some of those findings and explore them with further discussion. We also wanted to talk about, and did talk about, how hydrologic assessment and restoration relates to the goals of the various agencies and programs represented. So how does this work relate to the things that you are already trying to achieve in terms of water quality and flooding, et cetera, to better understand the barriers and to discuss information and support needs. What I'm going to share today are our key findings or themes based on preliminary results. I'll note that our collaborators at UW Extension, Anders and his team, are still combing through the transcripts and compiling the findings and the final report, but these are some of the big takeaways. And as we go through them, I'd like you to think about how degraded hydrology might be contributing to the problems that you're working on in your respective communities, or how adding some hydrologic restoration work to the suite of tools you're using could help you achieve your goals. So we started on a really great level of agreement with all of the participants, or most of the participants across all 3 samples, agreeing that historic and current land uses have altered hydrology and reduced the capacity of our waters to manage runoff, and that restoring degraded hydrology can help address many of our water management challenges, and often many at the same time, because some of this can be multi-objective work. Excuse me. We also asked participants to characterize the extent to which they or the agencies they worked with were engaged in hydrologic assessment and restoration work. And what we found was that more than half the sample indicated that it was only a little or sometimes none of their work. And keep in mind, these were folks that were recruited because they are working in water-related programs, so fisheries, runoff management, floodplain management, et cetera. So people representing a lot of water focused programs, but maybe not a lot of focus on hydrology within those programs. And then we thought that was a pretty significant finding. We also learned that some of the key types of information that are needed to understand how the landscape or how the hydrology has changed, and maybe more importantly, to what effect through human practices or natural processes and the consequences of those changes, that information was either not widely available, sometimes not available at all, or not readily accessible, and particularly that piece of how do we combine this information and then decide what it means for us, or how it's affecting our waterways. And we asked about the consequences of this in that first group, that remember the technical folks, so the hydrologists and the engineers, say what are the consequences of investing in practices and designing projects without a full understanding of the hydrologic context. And I'm going to share a quote that really sums up what we learned. So if you really don't understand the natural hydrologic system that it was meant to be, and then if you really don't understand how it's currently behaving as you're working and designing the future project, then usually that project fails. And this idea of project failure was a theme across the discussion we had with all three groups. I won't have time today to get into all of the examples or what they meant, but there were groups, as shown here, washouts being a big one, where we're investing money in projects and maybe the next big storm comes along and they just swoosh downstream. But I want to talk more about the last one, because there was this sense that maybe we are at times investing a lot of money in doing the same kinds of practices on our lands or in our waters, and we either aren't necessarily meeting our resource objectives, things aren't getting better, or maybe we're not sure how effective they are, or whether there are more effective practices out there. So it begs the need for more evaluation of different approaches. And of course, you can't have a conversation about water management without talking about climate. And there was large agreement that climate implications do amplify our water management challenges, so that in addition to maybe not fully understanding the hydrologic context that we're working in today, we face uncertainty about how our systems will behave moving forward, or how well our landscapes are equipped to handle the changes in precipitation and severe storms. So that resilience piece. Of course, we also talked a lot about barriers. I won't have time to get into all of these, but I want to focus on the last one, structural barriers, because it was there was a lot of discussion about how our programs and our policies do and don't support this kind of watershed scale hydrologic process focused work. So if I had to sum it up, I'd say the finding was that Wisconsin doesn't really have the structural frameworks in place currently to support watershed scale hydrologic assessment and restoration. And I qualify that with a yet, because of course the purpose of this project was to look at what's happening and what might be needed and how do we move forward. But I'll explain this in a little bit of context. So we had a lot of discussion on what's needed for watershed scale work versus what are we currently supporting, or how are our programs currently structured. So watershed scale work requires more advanced planning, longer time frames, more funding to do larger projects over longer time periods, and a lot of voluntary engagement, because most of the restoration work is, of course, happening on private lands. In contrast, the way a lot of our current water management programs, land and water management programs are structured, particularly through our soil and water resources programs, are focused on site-specific problems, species-specific enhancements. We're operating on 1 and 2 year funding cycles, and a lot of the work is designed to address non-compliance issues. So it's regulatory in nature, fixing what we know is broken at a specific site, as opposed to looking at what might be broken across a system and how we can improve the health of the system. So they're both needed, but they're really different approaches. And we have a bias towards the more site-specific options right now. So good news, we identified a lot of opportunities moving forward. The first thing I'll emphasize is that this watershed scale work has got to be locally led and defined by local problems and local priorities, and because it needs the local governments and the landowners and the volunteers. It's just really, it takes a lot of people, a lot of people like you out there doing this good work. The county land conservation staff especially, but really everyone was saying we really needed more demonstration projects at both the watershed and the site-specific scale to show what this work looks like, and to learn from one another on how we evaluate our restoration options and implement these kinds of practices. And of course, a lot more is needed in the realm of interagency and interdisciplinary coordination. There are some good things happening in this realm. I'll make note of one. There's a bill moving through the legislature right now that will establish a hydrologic restoration advisory council. We have a pretty good sense that that will pass, and it's going to provide a forum for the coming together of the agencies and the experts to talk about how do we build these supports so that those of you doing work in your communities have the data and information and resources needed to look at hydrologic restoration as an option in your work. If you're interested in more about what this work might look like, there are a couple of talks happening later this week in the regional sessions, one in the Central Wisconsin session, one in Lake Superior Basin session, about some projects that Wisconsin Wetlands Association has been involved in. And with that, I think I will wrap up, and I'll mention again that the full report will be out by the end of April. If you're interested in receiving a copy of that, I think Anders is going to pop a Google Doc link in the chat where you can put your name and email address. But in whatever time we have left, we're happy to take questions.
All right, thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
If you guys have any questions, please use the Q&A tab on the event Mobi to put those in there. We don't have any loaded yet, but if you think of something here, it's a lot of information to cover in about 15 minutes for Erin, and it's both conceptually and physically a huge undertaking. So, so it's something that I work in, so it's very interesting, and I think it's an important thing moving forward. So also remember, if you do go to the event page, you can click right on Erin's contact or anyone else involved with the project. And ask them directly too. Some of these questions might be very site specific or local, that would be addressed probably in a more direct format also. But if you do have a general question or anything that you want clarified, pop it into the Q&A. Otherwise, we will thank Erin, everyone else, Anders, involved with this project, and we will load up the next presentation here.
Thank you.